from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
What one word could you give people starting out? And the word that immediately flashed into my head was courage.
Write every day. Write and write and write. And if you have the ability and if you have the drive, the product will take care of itself. But you've got to do it.
Right.
Do it.
It's a question of perseverance.
Don't give me anything about writer's block. When you have writer's block, write. You know, that's how you unblock. You may write junk, and I do this all the time, but when you go back and read that chapter, you go, well, this is junk. And you rewrite it. No book is written. Every book is rewritten.
Oh, I get stuck all the time.
I was like, oh Christ.
I get stuck, I'll go and I'll take a walk.
Read is my first piece of advice, because the more you read, the better you write. That's just self-evident. Write. Keep writing, because the more you write, the better you write.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, writing a book. We have two guests joining us today. Dave Mullins, an associate professor of English and creative writing at Creighton University, will join us via Zoom a little bit later. First, I'd like to visit with Kevin Clowther. Kevin is an assistant professor and program coordinator for the Master of Fine Arts in Writing program at UNO. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Kathy.
All right, lots of good stuff in that opening video that we saw. What's the first thing that you encourage new writers to do?
Well, I think the people on the video had it right. You have to write every day. You have to treat it like a habit. What I tell my students to do is think about it the way they think about brushing their teeth. Make it part of your routine. And so I encourage new writers or people who've been writing for a long time to try to write at minimum for 15 minutes a day, 6 days a week, to make it feel like something that's part of your day. And if you keep doing that, if you put in the time, you will get better as a writer.
Okay, so people are watching and going, Kevin, 15 minutes a day, what do I write about? I mean, what's important?
Well, the really wonderful thing about writing, or one of the really wonderful things, is that every person has a unique way of seeing the world. Every person has her own memories, her own experiences, her own values. And you put onto the page whatever it is that you care about, whatever it is that you imagine, or whatever it is that you remember. There's nothing that you have to do. And in that way, writing is really unlike almost every other aspect of our life.
Okay, so I have to ask, is that what you did, Kevin? Or how did you get started as an author? Take us back.
Well, you'd have to ask my mom to be sure, but I know that I was a creative kid, and I was always doing different kinds of things. I was acting in plays, I was writing a neighborhood newspaper, I was drawing, I was making cartoons, and when I got to high school, I realized that the art that moved me the most was writing. It was stories and poems and novels. And so when I was in high school, I thought to myself, well, the best thing in the world to do would be to go to college and read a lot of books and teach writing, teach literature, to try to help other people feel the things that I felt when I was reading those stories. And only when I got to college did I realize that you could become a writer. To my mind, that was something that had already been earmarked for people in history. Most of the books that I'd read, maybe all of the books I'd read, were by people who were no longer alive. And so it didn't occur to me until I got to university that I could write my own stories. And so when I got to college, I started writing terrible stories and handing them into class and having them read in workshop, and I copied the voices of any number of authors. I wrote a Hemingway story, or I wrote a Jack Kerouac story, and eventually, after a lot of failure and a lot of submissions and a lot of writing and revising, I began to get a little bit better. And that's pretty much what I've been doing since I was 18 or 19 years old. Writing every day, reading a ton of stories, reading a ton of novels and poems, and trying to capture whatever is interesting in my mind onto the page, and most importantly, make it interesting to somebody else, because that's the difference between writing for an audience and writing a diary. Write a diary, you're the only audience member, but if you're writing for somebody else, you're trying to get that person to feel whatever it is you're feeling. You're trying to get that person to experience in her mind whatever it was that you were experiencing in your mind. So I'm always thinking about my readers.
Okay. You mentioned failure. You were thinking about that often as you were going down this path. Was there ever a point where you thought, nope, this really isn't for me? I've tried to convince myself that it is, but it's not.
I would imagine that if you put truth serum in just about any writer, that person would tell you that he thought about giving up at one point or another. It certainly can feel pointless if you're staring at a screen for 2 or 3 hours and you write a sentence only to erase it, and then you go back downstairs and realize that you've accomplished nothing at all. But literature has been so important to me that the idea of getting somebody to really feel something on the page just matters so much that I can't bring myself to quit it. I can't think of any other vocation I would have that would be as motivating or as inspiring to me day after day. The only thing that comes close from a professional perspective is helping other people make their stories better. And on a certain level, I find that even more gratifying now. When I see somebody get better over the course of a semester or over the course of a program, that really is as moving as writing a good story on my own.
Okay. Biggest obstacle, Kevin, that you encountered from the time you were little all the way through college, how did you overcome it?
Well, the biggest obstacle for me was and is time. You know, writing is inexpensive. All you need is a pen and a piece of paper, but time is expensive. And when you are working full-time, when you're a parent, when you have family obligations or professional obligations, it can be difficult to prioritize writing. Or sometimes it can be the case that you've carved out some time for writing, but you no longer feel creative because you have a million other things going on in your brain. And so over the course of the last 20 plus years that I've been doing it, I would say that time has been the biggest obstacle. And what I've had to do is what I imagine most writers have to do, which is just prioritize the writing. You have to make sure that you do that, and maybe you don't do something else because of it.
Okay, but you don't not read, right? Is it true that in order to be a good writer, you also have to be a good reader?
It's true. It's true. You have to read widely and you have to read regularly. And I encourage students, I encourage anyone who's interested in writing to try to read work that expands your sense of what's possible on the page. And so if you're writing traditional realist fiction, don't just read traditional realist fiction. Read fantastical stuff, read sci-fi, read fantasy, read horror, read stuff that's hundreds of years old, read things that came out a week ago, read all kinds of different fiction. And that will expand your sense of what you might accomplish on the page. But without reading, I don't think that you could write, because that's how you learn to put sentences together. That's how you learn to put paragraphs together, by either consciously or unconsciously paying attention to what different people are doing. And writers are always expanding the sense of what we can do on the page. People are doing things right now in 2021 that we've never seen before. And that was also the case in 1850 and 1650 and so forth. Okay,
big question. With whom should you share your writing, and when? Especially talking to those first-time writers now. At what point do we know, after our 15 minutes each day of writing, that we should actually reach out to somebody to get an opinion?
So my personal feeling on this is that you should not share your writing with someone until you feel like you don't know how to make that piece of writing better. Now, that might mean that you've had it for a week, it might mean that you've had it for 2 months, it might mean that you've had it for 10 years. But if you share writing when you're still in the generative stage and you get a lot of line edits and you get a lot of commentary, that can be discouraging and it can mess up whatever vision you have in your mind. But if you share the writing at the point where you really don't know how to make it better, I think you can have an open mind about the feedback that you receive. I share my writing with 2 or 3 trusted readers from graduate school, with my wife, and with my agent.
Okay, so people watching, I think there's something very valuable in what you said there, in that if you share too soon and somebody tells you what you don't want to hear, that could discourage you. So let's say you've got an individual who wants to write and they have 12 people in their lives that they trust, and do they automatically go to the ones who might be a little more positive? Because we know, I mean, our friends and family, we know who they are and what kind of advice they might be willing to share with us. Do we go half and half? I mean, how do we break that up?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think encouragement is so important. Because writing is a solitary process, because you do it alone, and because you reread your sentences so many times, it can be hard to get outside of your head. And so oftentimes when you hand a story to somebody, what you really want that person to say to you is, it's great. So that matters. But you're not going to get better from somebody telling you that you're great. So it is important to have encouragement in your life, but I think it's important to have trusted readers, people whose aesthetic you value, read your work. And it can take a while to find the right people. If you're a student, I encourage you to look around and see the readers whose opinions you trust. And if you're not a student and you're part of a writing group or a writing club, within that group or club, try to find the people whose values and judgments you trust. If you hand your work to somebody and you don't believe in that person's aesthetic, you're probably not going to value the feedback you receive.
Okay, good advice. All right, this might be a good time to talk about UNO and the programs here and how you're involved in all of that.
Sure. So for the undergraduates, I teach fiction writing at a couple of different levels. Right now I'm teaching an intermediate and advanced fiction writing course, and this summer I'll be teaching an introductory fiction writing course. And I also teach through the Thompson Learning Community an autobiographical reading and writing course to first semester students here at UNO. I teach in the graduate writing program, the MFA in writing. That's the program that I direct. And that's a low residency program, which might be a phrase that's unfamiliar to a lot of people out there. What that means is that both our students and faculty come from all across the country. We have people in the West, the Southwest, the Midwest, the East, the Northeast, the South, and so forth. And they gather in Nebraska City twice a year for 10 days, and we have a series of readings, lectures, and workshops. And the idea is to immerse those students and faculty in writing, where they are just living, eating, drinking, and breathing writing for 10 days at a time. And then while the students are there, I pair them with a faculty member, and the student and the faculty member together devise an individual study plan. So when everyone goes home, instead of the student logging on to a class online or going to a traditional classroom, that student is working on her own toward a manuscript. And the student is sending in the work to the faculty member sending back feedback, they're meeting via Zoom or they're talking on the phone. It's essentially an individual tutorial over the course of the semester. And then every student and faculty member comes back to Nebraska City, we meet again, all new workshops, all new readings, all new lectures, and I'd send the student off to a second faculty member, and that student and that faculty member devise a study plan for the next semester. So over the course of the master's degree, each student comes to Nebraska City 4 times, each student works with 4 different faculty members, and when the student comes back for the 5th and final residency, it is the student who delivers a lecture, the student who delivers a reading, and that's when the diploma is conferred.
Okay, somebody who can relate very well to what you've been talking about today, Dave Mullins. We want to bring him into the conversation. Dave, of course, is with Creighton University. Okay, Dave, I have to ask, what's your favorite tip and maybe short story about how you became an author?
Yeah, you know, the best tip I think I would give would be very similar to a couple of the things Kevin talked about, which is make writing a habit. You know, I always say to treat it like a job. Log in and log 2 hours a day, week, depending on the week, and I log my minutes. So I write down the time that I start. If I take a break to grab a cup of coffee, I mark the minute, and I log back in when I sit back down at the desk, and I make sure I hit my 2 or 3 hours, whatever I've planned for myself for that day. I think if you treat it that way, if you treat it as an obligation that you love, you get work done, and before you know it, maybe you've finished a book. But it's very important, I think, not to wait for inspiration, but rather to, again, make it a daily habit. And of course, reading, again, a huge part of the process, as Kevin mentioned. Reading as much as you possibly can, learning from what you read, not being afraid to be inspired by what you read, and kind of celebrating that part of the process. And I think a lot of young writers are sort of ashamed of that, of the kind of copying and mimicry that goes on at the early stages for a lot of writers. I always say, don't be afraid of it, don't be ashamed of it, embrace that and make it part of the process, as Kevin mentioned. I got started as a writer at the age of about 17. I started writing very bad poems, and quickly fell in love with the art form. This happened in an AP English class that I was in my senior year in high school, and then I quickly transitioned into writing short fiction. I wrote short stories kind of obsessively all through college, and spent much more time as a college student writing my own work and reading what I wanted to read, probably than I did on my schoolwork that was assigned to me, which I think in the end was beneficial. But yeah, it quickly became really nothing short of an obsession for me, both reading and writing. And I did it for hours and hours each day. And when I got out of school as an undergrad, realized that I wanted to pursue it as a career. And so then I went on to get my MFA after that.
Dave, you brought up poetry, which is very interesting. Do you find that a good chunk of people who want to begin writing start with poetry for whatever reason, or I don't know?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I can speak from my own experience in the sense that I do know several writers who began as several fiction writers who began as poets. Again, I certainly did. I think there's something about poetry, because of its brevity, that makes it seem attractive to a young writer. I mean, of course, most poems are even shorter than short stories, so it seems like a manageable and kind of workable, genre to begin with. I think I sort of fooled myself at a young age into thinking that I was good at poetry and thinking that it was sort of for some reason or another, an easy thing to pick up, when in fact it's quite difficult. I found writing short stories to be much easier to sort of learn than writing poetry was, which is not to say it wasn't difficult in its own way, writing fiction. But poetry was sort of fun for me, whereas writing fiction was always difficult and still is. And maybe that's why I think I'm better at it than I am with poetry.
It seems like every trade requires tools, Dave. What would you say are the tools that a writer would need?
Yeah, I think perseverance is a big one. I mean, we can kind of talk about the sort of bag of tricks or the skills or techniques that a writer has to learn in terms of structuring narrative and creating characters and writing quality sentences and that sort of stuff. But I think in a larger sense, perseverance is a huge one, and I think being goal-driven is a big one too. I also think attention to detail is very important. But to go back to perseverance, I think if you can't persevere through self-doubt and through rejection, I don't think you'll get very far. It's such a difficult process, writing a book, publishing a book. It's time consuming, it's arduous on a daily basis. And the fact of the matter is, most writers vacillate between thinking this is the greatest thing they've ever written and it's the worst thing they've ever written. And on those days when you think the book is the worst thing you've ever written, you still have to force yourself to the desk. Something I say a lot in class, I quote Dr. J a lot, Julius Erving, of the Philadelphia 76ers from the 1970s, who said famously in an interview that being a professional means doing the things you love to do on the days you don't want to do them. And I think that's a big part of being a writer. You're not have to, again, doubt and through the feelings of laziness that sort of come. And again, attention to detail I think is so incredibly important. Joan Didion was once asked in an interview, what advice would you give to a young writer? And she said, you better love sentences. And I think that's so important. I think a lot of young writers I come across seem to love storytelling kind of in a larger, broader sense. And what I try to do is enforce the importance of paying attention to the detail of a sentence, to the details of punctuation, and to the rhythm and cadence of your paragraphs. And I think that attention to detail will ultimately expand to an attention on narrative, but you kind of have to begin with the minutia.
Okay, and Dave, you mentioned publisher. At what point do you know you need a publisher, right? And where do you even begin with that?
Yeah, Kevin talked about writing for an audience as opposed to writing for yourself. And I've done a lot of personal writing in my life. And of course, I've done a lot of writing for audiences. And I think they're very, very different. When I'm sitting down to work on a novel or a short story, I'm thinking very, very consciously about my audience the entire time. I'm thinking about the length of the piece from the very beginning. I'm thinking about communicating effectively ideas and scenes and characters and dramatic action. But I think if I get too far ahead of myself and I think past the audience to a publisher, for me it can be detrimental to the process. I usually don't think about the idea of publishing until I've got a short story done. It's complete. A novel done, complete. I can't do anything else with it. And then I'll begin to think about sending it off to my agent or sending a story off to a magazine. But for me, that's a long way down the road. It typically takes me 3 to 5 months for a short story, not only to craft it and revise it, but to get feedback from friends and to kind of get it to the point where I can't do anything else with it after getting all that feedback. And then I'll typically start sending it out to magazines. And even as it inevitably gets rejections, I've never published a story after sending it out only once. But even after I get those rejections, I'll continue to revise and to edit and to rework it based on the feedback that I get.
We're going to put up a graphic for our viewers. Brightest places in the world, Dave. We have a few minutes left in this interview. In about a minute, tell us about this piece.
Yes, so the novel begins with an explosion at a chemical plant on the outskirts of Las Vegas in the Mojave Desert. And the novel then traces the lives of 4 people who are kind of directly affected by this industrial disaster and whose lives are kind of irrevocably changed. And you watch how their existences kind of intersect and overlap over the course of about 6 months. Most of it is set in Las Vegas, where I grew up. And then a lot of it is also set in the Nevada desert between Las Vegas and Reno.
Okay, thank you. And Kevin, we're going to change gears now and go to you. We're going to put up another graphic. This would be something I think very familiar to you. This would be your book. Go ahead and put that up for us. Yep. We were flying to Chicago. What's important to know about that?
Well, those are a bunch of stories I wrote at various points over the course of about 10 years. The stories don't have a lot in common with each other beyond that they all have to do with questions I had when the stories were either written or revised. And so in the case of the title story, I was on a flight with my wife from New York to Detroit, and the flight was detoured to Chicago, and everyone on the plane groaned. And I was looking around at the different people on the plane and began to imagine what was going through their heads, and the story went off from there. And so all of the stories are questions I was working my way toward an answer. And that's what I encourage my students to do when they don't know what to write about, to ask themselves a question they don't know the answer to and just keep writing until they come up with something.
Okay, thank you. And a question for the two of you now, and we only have about a minute to give each of you for this. An author, and Dave, we'll start with you, an author who almost wasn't, and the story behind it.
Yeah, so one of my favorite writers is a guy named Tom Jones. He's not read very frequently anymore, but in the 90s, all throughout that decade, he was a very famous American short story writer. And he went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, where Kevin and I both went, graduated in the 70s. And he was in a class with a lot of other very famous writers, most notably Jane Smiley, who won the Pulitzer Prize. And he Tom Jones, I think more than 20 years went by, and friends were sort of wondering when he was ever going to publish anything. And he published his first short story in the New Yorker at the age of, I believe, 47. And it's a story called The Pugilist at Rest. And it's also the title story of his debut collection of stories. And it kind of catapulted him to almost overnight fame as a short story writer. But he himself talked a lot about how his career almost didn't happen because he just spent years really doing nothing but running marathons and boxing, believe it or not, and kind of ignoring his writing, and then fell back into it at the age of almost 50.
Okay, thank you. And Kevin, we have less than a minute for you.
Well, I'm thinking of a writer who grew up in rural Canada. Her father was a turkey farmer and her mother was a school teacher. She went to school, she got married, she moved out west with her husband, she had children, she raised those children, and only in her late 30s did she publish her first book of short fiction. And then from there she kept publishing books of short fiction until she won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And to my mind, Alice Munro's the greatest short story writer in English, and she wasn't known by anyone at all until she was 37 or 38 years old.
Wow, thank you so much. Kevin Clowther and Dave Mullins here today talking to us about how to get started writing a book. So for people who want more information, they can go to unomaha.edu and get a hold of Kevin. He'd be happy to talk with you. Creighton EDU, that's Dave. And then of course that opening video, authormagazine.org. I want to thank them both for joining us. What a great program. As we close, a look at scenes from Papillion Park as seen through the lens of Wesley Weeks, a junior at UNL. I want to thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at netnebraska.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.
For more than 20 years, only one program has addressed topics that matter to viewers. Only one program delivers the information that Nebraskans need to live the good life. I'm Kathy Wyatt. Join my guests and me as we discuss those issues every week on a program we call Consider This.